It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Alexander Aleynikov to the University of Illinois at Chicago. Alexander Aleynikov is University Professor and Director of the Solberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School of Social Research in New York. The Institute of Migration and Mobility is among the most prestigious research centers for the study of refugee affairs in the world, and is named after the late Aristide Solberg, one of the most influential and iconic intellectuals studying human movement, who for many years taught at the New School. Professor Aleynikov has held positions in diverse higher education institutions, including the University of Michigan and Georgetown University, where he was Dean of the Law Center and Executive Vice President of the Law Center's Center Affair. Over the years, he has received important distinctions and awards, including the Excellence in International Migration Scholarship from the Center for Migration Studies in New York City and the Advocacy Award of the Jesuit Service. In 2014, he became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Aleynikov's academic production is vast. He's the author of more than 10 books and more than 50 journal articles and book chapters. During his prolific career, he has made substantial contributions to several important debates. I would like to underscore two, although his contribution extends to several other areas. First, he has contributed to the understanding of citizenship and its relationship to policy in the realm of migration. And his keynote address is going to talk precisely about this interesting relationship. Aleynikov is part of an important stream of scholars investigating the logic, sources, and nature of citizenship policies and their relationship with modern constitutional theory from within a comparative perspective. Examples of this work include his book, Semblances of Sovereignty, the Constitution, the State, and Citizenship, published by Harvard University Press, and a reader on modern constitutional theory that's already in his 5th edition, published by the West Publishing Company. Second, he has furthered our understanding of the evolution of the existing international regime governing the movement of people and the protection of refugees. Examples of his work in this realm include his latest book, The Arc of Protection, Reforming the International Refugee Regime, which is what he's going to talk today about, published by Stanford University Press and co-authored with Leah Zamore. Professor Aleynikov's work has bridged the gap between migration scholars who concentrate their attention on economic migrants and scholars working on forced migration, broadly conceived, who investigate the plight of refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless people, and other populations. And as we saw this morning, Tara Sara and many others in a way invoked or underscores the idea of trying to bridge these different literatures, because in essence, when we look at movements today, we are talking about basically mixed population flows, in which distinguishing one category of migrants from another is oftentimes quite difficult. In some of his most recent work, Professor Aleynikov has critically examined the recent processes and negotiations surrounding the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. Outside academia, Professor Aleynikov has held important positions and served as a powerful voice informing debates on migration and refugee policy. In so doing, he has made critical contributions to the understanding and visibility of these topics in policy circles. He was Deputy High Commissioner at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees between 2010 and 2015, during the tenure of Antonio Guterres as High Commissioner. He also worked as Executive Associate Commissioner for Programs and General Counsel of the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the U.S. Department of Justice between 1995 and 1997. In addition, he has contributed to debates on refugee policy through his influential work in many think tanks. He has served as Senior Associate of the Migration Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace and Senior Associate and Director of the Comparative Citizenship Project at the Migration Policy Institute, where he's continuing to work. So without further delay, let's give a round of applause for our distinguished guest.
Andres, thank you. It was very kind. You had got everything there except, I think, my high school affiliation. That was very kind of you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me, and really delighted to be here. I'm really glad this is coming from the Humanities Institute here. I think the humanities is such an important way. This came up in some of the discussion earlier, to talk about these issues. And I wish I were a poet or a videographer or even a scholar of literature, because it doesn't seem that the facts matter much anymore, but it's much more the narratives, the way we think about these issues. And I want to talk about the current situation we find ourselves in, and what can we do to improve the situation at the global level. Some of these suggestions may strike you as somewhat radical. So maybe I am writing science fiction, I suppose, or at least exercising an active imagination. But I do hope to persuade you that the reforms that I'll describe here are certainly necessary and maybe even possible in today's very troubled world. Just several opening points to make here, and I think that things came up, as said in the last panel, the phrase refugee crisis talks about, I think Adam Goodman said this is more a discussion about, if you say crisis, you're talking about states, you're not talking about people. So perhaps we should be talking about refugee tragedies and not a refugee crisis, or the refugee panic that Tara Zara mentioned. There is a crisis, political crisis in the global north. There's a crisis caused by populist politics who have made refugees scapegoats. And there's a crisis in this country where the United States has lost its leadership in the world on refugee and asylum issues. But the problem that I'll describe, and the point I want to make, which is often really uninteresting for discussions like this, is this is a situation, the refugee situation around the world is entirely manageable. And in some ways, by using the phrase crisis, the word crisis, we play into the very politics we're fighting. Because if we call it a crisis, and maybe it calls for securitization of borders and armies and other things to stop the crisis. Now, once we say it's entirely manageable, people just fall asleep. Okay, so just go manage it. But what I mean by that is, the numbers are really not very large at a global level. We know how to handle refugee flows. The world's been doing it for many years. As Lynette pointed out, refugees are not helpless people that require constant humanitarian assistance, but they're people who just a few months or a few years or a decade before they became a refugee were living lives and taking care of families and doing things that people do, and we need to give people the wherewithal to get back on their feet and rebuild their lives. But that's stuff we know how to do if we have the political will to do it. The Western world, the global northern world, is not collapsing because of refugees. I sometimes get questions like, so what's the impact of refugees on the economy of the United States? And I say zero. In fact, as was pointed out earlier this morning, there's a net benefit of refugees in the United States, but certainly in terms of cost, I say zero because the number of refugees is tiny. We have a workforce of 150 million people in this country. The number of refugees coming into the country is so small as to be negligible. And yet somehow we have this idea that refugees are coming, burdening the system and changing the economy. It's just, anyway, that's point number one. It's manageable. I'll say more about that. The second thing, as a preface here, I want to say is that because of the press, the pictures, the horrible pictures of boats going down in the Mediterranean, the death of Alan Kurdi on a Turkish beach, other pictures of people, of the caravans and movement through Mexico. The point I'm going to make here is that yes, there is dangerous movement going on here, but that's not the central problem facing the refugee world, the refugee regime. Rather, the central problem is one of immobility, not dangerous mobility, and I'll try to explain that in moments ahead. Okay, so there was some talk this morning about the current situation. I'm not going to read these slides, but you can take a look and see the numbers. We do count about 70 million. So let's be careful about this number. This is about 70 million people displaced because of conflict and violence. So it includes IDPs, as was mentioned, internally displaced people, about 25 million refugees, about 40 million or so internally displaced people, people who haven't crossed an international border but have been forced from their homes. And this is about people displaced because of violence and conflict. It does not include people displaced primarily because of climate, although those things often go together, and I'll have more to say about that a bit later on. But this is a big number, but in a world of 7 billion or more plus, it's really not that big. All right, next slide here. Again, I don't know, you can just gaze your eyes. In some ways, our eyes glaze over at these kinds of numbers, but you get a sense there. These are taken from every year UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the refugee agency, publishes a document, actually comes out in June on World Refugee Day, and it's called Global Trends and reports the previous year. So I've just stolen pages from their document here. And here are some of the major instances of refugee flows. The Rohingya really discriminated against, more than that, violence perpetrated against a Muslim community in Myanmar, and they are now form the largest refugee camp in neighboring Bangladesh. You know, in some ways, the Rohingya are the classic refugee definition. They fit. This is a persecuted group that has been murdered and raped and pushed out of their homes. As I said, in a classic sense of being a discriminated, hated group pushed out of a country. Most of the world's refugees don't fit this definition. Most of the world's refugees today are people who are fleeing civil war but have come to be recognized as refugees, and I'll say something about that. But the Rohingya are a horrible classic example. I mean, horrible in the sense of what's happened to them and to their community. The Western Hemisphere, once again, has a huge situation here. You can see the chart from where people went of forced displacement from Venezuela. About 4 million people have left Venezuela. And again, this is a mixed flow. Some people pushed from their homes, some people who voluntarily left. Venezuelans are among the largest group of asylum seekers in the United States. You don't hear about that. You hear about the Salvadorans and the Guatemalans. You can ask yourselves, why don't we talk about the Venezuelans? You'll have your own views on that, but it's for the Western Hemisphere, it's a huge flow of people. And the DRC was mentioned, I think Lynette mentioned that often countries have both refugees and internally displaced people. The Congolese are refugees in Rwanda and Tanzania and other places, but there's a very large internally displaced population of Congolese in the DRC, and that's been ongoing for many, many years. We say called the inconvenient refugee because, you know, we have a world of nation states, and we're supposed to have people living in a state, supposed to be this holy trinity of state, population, and territory. And refugees really create, we say in the book, they're a perturbation in that system because they are forced out of their homes, but they have no place to go except into another state. So, I mean, we ought to be clear as a political matter, refugees make a very strong claim in our current regime of nation states in the following way. Nation states, and again, sovereignty came up in the earlier panel. Nation states under international law are deemed to have sovereign control over their borders and their rights of who can come in and who can become citizens of those states. That's sort of bedrock international law. And for all the work that's been done on human rights and humanitarian intervention, all the ways in which now we think international law may penetrate the states on the citizenship and immigration side, that has stayed fairly constant. That is really a deep decision for the state. And to make that decision for the state is to attack that state's sovereignty. And since the state system that we currently have, until we move to some other form of international life, you can't have states unless you have that firm understanding, it is said, of borders and who's in and who's out and who belongs and who doesn't. And what refugees do here is refugees make this very strong claim saying, yes, states, you have a right to control your borders and say who comes in or out, but we want in, and you can't send us back. And as I said, that's a strong claim in a world of sovereign states. It's one that we recognize because we have a refugee convention or protocol that most states of the world have agreed to as an act of sovereignty. You can say to that extent they've kind of surrendered their sovereignty to that kind of claim. But let's be aware that in the current world of states, this is a strong claim, and refugees are viewed, inconvenient obviously should be put in quotes there. But you get a sense of the categories here. The large stripe at the bottom is the IDPs, internally displaced people who haven't moved, refugees, yellow, and then, what am I saying? I'm sorry, yellow are Palestinian refugees, then other refugees under UNHCR's care, and the top part are asylum seekers around the world. Here are the main sending and receiving countries of refugees and IDPs. Some overlap, but not entire overlap. And here are the major sending countries. Not surprising. My guess is if you had to close your eyes and come up with the list, you probably would have, by reading the newspaper, known this list. And this may be less familiar to you with the countries where there are high numbers of IDPs, internally displaced people. It gets less focus, and I'll have a lot to say about that in a moment as to why we don't have a regime, international legal regime that protects internally displaced people. And this has produced what we describe, the current problem that we're addressing in the book is what we call the second exile. And what we mean by that is that people are forced from their homes. That's the first exile. But they don't find a solution to that displacement. They're left in the state of limbo that was described earlier. For refugees, most can't go home because the conflict hasn't ended. The international system is not solving conflicts these days. We seem to be creating more conflicts. We're not solving conflicts. It's not safe for people to return. The resettlement numbers were never a very large part of the overall flow. If there are 25 million refugees, maybe in a good year there were a couple of 100,000 refugees resettled, but never a major part of that, and that's gone way down given the drop in U.S. resettlement. And the third, what's usually called typical traditional solution of local integration, has been resisted by hosting states. And again, I'm referring to what was said in the earlier session about 85 to 90% of refugees are in the global south. And those countries are saying, look, we got our own problems to take care of our own citizens. Global north, what are you doing? How many refugees are you taking? And we're not interested in integrating and making citizens out of refugees because we want them to go home. They're not our folks, and we're taking care of them while they're here, but they're not going to have rights to fully integrate. And this creates this condition of second exile, of people who are just not able to reintegrate into a community, economic, a social community. And if you think about the harms of or the burdens of being a refugee, you've left your home, you've left your home community. Often members of the family are scattered. You're in a new place where you may not know the language. Think about, yes, when Syrians moved to Lebanon and Jordan, they could speak Arabic. When 3 million refugees moved to Turkey, many of them probably did not know Turkish. So you have language issues, education issues, and most of these states don't give refugees a right to work, so you have the economic burdens when you get there. And then thirdly, you have the psychological harm of not knowing your future. You don't know where you're going to ultimately fit in. And in many ways, we don't talk about that much, but if you think about if you weren't sure where you belong, what country you belong to, where your community is. And when you have these long-standing refugee situations that don't get solved because people can't go home, aren't resettled, and can't locally integrate, they live in this sense of not knowing their status. And if you put all those factors together, you can see that the second exile is more than just a statement of a condition. It's really a statement of the harm that we visit upon refugees by not resolving these systems and fixing the system. And it's the second exile is the fundamental way that our current refugee system is broken. It's not the boats going across the Mediterranean. It's not asylum seekers at the southwest border. Those are problems that have to be dealt with. There have been thousands of people who've died in the Mediterranean. Every single death is a tragedy. But that's a function of the fact that we have not been able to deal with these underlying long-standing refugee situations. And that's what the book is about, is really trying to think about, are there ways to make that better? Okay. So it's the state of precariousness here, this long-standing state of precariousness that we, the existence of that we think is why the system is fundamentally broken. And to say that is it's obviously not accomplishing its goals. That wasn't the purpose of the refugee regime when it was created in its most recent form after World War II. It's just not working to restore the lives and dignity of these millions of displaced people. And this is a system, this is really a crucial part here. This was a system created by states for states, right? It was put in place after World War II with the adoption of the convention and creation of UNHCR by states to figure out a solution to the so-called inconvenient refugee. So what we try to do in the book is, I am a lawyer, but we don't make this a legal, this is not a book about legal binding norms. And typically when one talks about how to fix the refugee system, people talk like lawyers. Well, expand the definition of refugee to cover more people, interpret the convention to do certain things, or adopt a new law and things. And we start in a different place. We start by saying, let's, if we can, kind of wipe the slate clean. What would a fair, decent, humane, responsible system of refugee protection and assistance look like? What would be the underlying principles of that system? And we identify 5, and we're after lunch here, and I know so I'm going to try to be quick and interesting on each of these 5 to keep you going here. But I'll do this quickly. So what I'm saying here is the argument is not what we are commanded to do as a matter of law, but rather what should we do as a matter of decent international policy. So the first principle is one of safety. And that has 2 really important parts. You have to grant access to people who are fleeing unsafe situations. And you have to guarantee that they won't be returned to those dangerous situations. Now, the current system works on one but not the other. The right that is identified in the Refugee Convention, and the one that lawyers focus most on, is this right of, I think it was mentioned earlier, non-refoulement, French phrase meaning non-return. So the idea is that people can't be returned to places where they'll be persecuted on one of the 5 grounds identified in the convention. And the idea is pretty clear. I mean, the whole system has to work not to return people where they will be harmed in a dramatic way. In that way, the system works pretty well. We don't have many cases there. We can find examples. We can look to examples of some returns, but pretty well we live up to a system of non-refoulement. If we have time, I can talk more technically about how the principle of non-refoulement could be expanded beyond its current legal stuff, but I'll leave that to the side right now. On the access side, we work well and not so well. So, in point of fact, most refugees are able to flee to a country of first asylum, the country next door, and receive some kind of protection. There's some ability to stay, even if it's in a very informal status, and it lasts for a long time. Now, ultimately, with the Syrian refugees, Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan said enough is enough. We've had 5 million refugees, and we're going to say no more, or far fewer can come. But generally around the world, there is this ability to come in. The problem is in the secondary, what are called secondary movements, right? So the movement across the Mediterranean, when the rest of the world put up their walls like dominoes coming down from Austria and Hungary and down through the Balkans and the like, and then eventually into Greece. And then the deal that was struck between Greece, between the EU and Turkey to basically keep refugees in Turkey. So access to the global north has not been guaranteed in any way. And President Trump has made that absolutely clear at the southwest border by saying, we're just not going to let folks in. And if they get in somehow, we're going to say they're not entitled to asylum, and we will send them back. So a very mixed message on access. I think there was some mention of David Fitzgerald's new book that came about a year ago, deals really well with all the various strategies in the global north, in Australia, Europe, the United States, that those states have kept people from coming in and asking for asylum, which has meant that people have stayed in these countries of first asylum. So safety is the first principle. Second is we call enjoyment of asylum. It's an odd kind of phrase, enjoyment of asylum. It comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says to people that people are entitled to seek and enjoy asylum. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not binding law, but it makes a very important statement, a principle here that people in a state of asylum, people who are refugees, should have the ability to restart their lives, to work, to support and offer support for people who can't work. Under this principle, it recognizes that the Refugee Convention is a rights-based convention. It's a human rights convention written in the early 50s. Again, lawyers tend to focus on the definition of who is a refugee and the fact you can't be returned. But in between those other articles, there are a long list of important rights for refugees. The right to work, the right to free movement in the country you're a refugee, the right to the protection of welfare laws and of labor laws, the right to pursue a profession and open a business. Now, these rights are stated in comparative ways sometimes, so refugees have the same right to open a business as other lawful immigrants in the country, et cetera. But the rights are guaranteed, the right to education. These are all rights given to refugees to help them rebuild their lives, to help them achieve self-reliance if they can. And it comes about in the following way, because we have to put ourselves back in the 50s when the convention was written. We sometimes think about the Refugee Convention. It was written to deal with the problem of the masses of people who fled, who were forced in their homes after World War II, and it really wasn't. By the time the convention is written in the 50s, the vast majority of people had already either returned home or been resettled. That had been taken care of by the Allied commanders, then by other international organizations. But there were about 1 million refugees left in Western Europe at that point. And people knew refugees would be coming from Eastern Europe because the communist bloc had been established. And the idea was, how do we get now the Western European countries to integrate these refugees, to give them rights to take care of themselves? Because if you give people a right to work and take care of their families and give them access to labor laws and welfare laws, then you don't need unending humanitarian assistance, right? The international community can back out as people take care of themselves. That was the motivating idea behind, in my view, behind the rights in this convention. And I'll say a bit more about how this has been operationalized more recently. But it's crucial. If we have a world of the second exile, one way out of that is to really enforce these rights. The reason I'm focusing on this is these rights are violated routinely around the world. Most countries do not recognize the right of refugees to work, or if they do, they have to pay for a permit that no one can afford, or they're restricted to particular industries or kinds of jobs. So we cut this off at the very early stage of allowing people to enjoy asylum. The third principle is the principle of solutions, and this is the classic way that we talk in the refugee world about you have to have solutions. And I've mentioned the traditional 3 solutions of return, resettlement, or local integration. And as I've said, and I'll have much more to say about this in a moment, none of those is working right now. In fact, I'm forgetting to go through my slides here. I think I had all these wonderful slides. Here's safety, the number of people who get asylum, and some stories of people who've attained safety. Ecuador, large flow from, first from Colombia and now from Venezuela. And Lebanon, of course, a major place of the Syrian flow. And then these are asylum seekers who have also been able to request asylum in countries further afield. Here's enjoyment of asylum. Sorry, my slides, it shows I'm a guy of words, not images here, unfortunately, but. And then here are the solutions. This is what I wanted to get to, is to give you a sense of how the solutions are failing here. The number of people who return. There are some Afghans who've returned. These So the Afghan refugees fled in 1979 when the Soviet Union, as we still talked about it, invaded. And they went to Iran and Pakistan. Some have gone back, but many have not. And then look at this. This is the resettlement numbers. So the top number, that blue line, UNHCR every year looks around the world and says that the 25, 20 million, whatever number of refugees, some of them really need to be resettled. They're particularly vulnerable, or maybe they have family elsewhere, but often it could be single moms with kids or something, and they identify what here, about 1.5 million. And then look at that red line. That's the number of refugees that are actually offered for resettlement. Resettlement submissions by UNHCR to resettling states, and the numbers are even much lower, not much lower, but lower than that red number. So you see for all the fuss that's made about we can't be taking refugees in, it's terrible, it's just such a tiny slice of the overall refugee numbers. It doesn't mean it's not incredibly important, and I'll have a lot, if asked, I'll say a lot more about the U.S. refugee resettlement process and system, which is, as was pointed out, is failing in this country. But you see, it's not a serious candidate for a major solution to the problem. Okay, here's my, now I'm getting to my fourth principle here, mobility. So, I said that the central problem for refugees these days is immobility. They are able to flee across the border to the country next door, and they stay. They can't go home, they don't go further. They're kind of pushed out and then locked in to that country. Can we imagine a world where refugees have more mobility? We think this would be an important principle. One, it would allow refugees to move to a place where they can actually take care of themselves through work, through family, through study, through something else. And it would reduce the burden on that one receiving country if people could move to other countries. I know what you're thinking. This is impossible in today's world, but I'll get to that and maybe convince you otherwise. Okay. And then the last is refugee voice. And I'm really delighted that this conference will include refugee voices here. And it's really important to say refugee voices because we can't, I'm so used to having panels where there are 5 scholars and 1 refugee who tells you the refugee view, of course. And we're talking about huge diversity among refugee populations. And this has really been left out of the international community's consideration of refugee matters. You see the top is a demonstration in Papua New Guinea where Australia has been sending boat people for a number of years. And below is a kind of typical meeting that UNHCR has in the field when UNHCR has offices in 120 different countries, and when there are refugees there, they'll meet with the refugees and say, we're going to plan a program, what should we do, et cetera, et cetera. It's not always successful, and I think as that picture shows, it's often just with the men in the group, so there are gender issues that need to be resolved as well on these things. So there's some attempt. But this is, I'm stating this now as a principle, then we'll get to how this may be operationalized. Okay, so if we think this is what a decent system would have, it would provide safety, it would allow people who've been given safety a chance to rebuild their lives, enjoyment asylum, it would offer them a solution because no one should be a refugee forever, it would give them the right to move so that they could find a solution, and it would give them voice in the system to say what's wrong with the system and how it can be improved. I mean, you may want to add a 6 or 7 principle, but if we had those 5, I'd be pretty happy as to how we've improved the system. And as I've tried to say as we've gone through this, most of these are not being met in any substantial way. So then the question becomes, so who do these principles apply to? And there was a lot of discussion in the earlier session about how we define refugees. And I say, typically the lawyers take over here and say, well, under the Convention of Refugees are someone with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Now let's talk about who fits within that category. And I say that with fondness. I've taught refugee law to law students for many years, and these are great discussions. But it's not... the position we take in the book is it's not adequate. And there are attempts now to push out the definition of refugees. So can we include other kinds of groups? And Lynette mentioned the convention that the Organization of African Unity adopted a number of years ago that adopted a broader definition of refugee. It said we take the 1951 convention and we add to that people who are fleeing civil disorder. basically. And she mentioned also the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, which has been adopted by some states, again, saying people fleeing disorder. I'm sorry, the African Unity Convention also mentions, I think, people fleeing natural disasters. Maybe that's in Cartagena. But people in a situation of beyond simply showing directed, targeted persecution towards other reasons that people flee. And this has been widely accepted. So in the Syria situation, 5 million Syrian refugees, you know, if they get to Germany or the United States, there's going to be a judicial proceeding, basically. You come in and show you have a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of these grounds. But throughout the Middle East, where people fled to, there wasn't a single hearing like that. People fleeing the civil war were registered as refugees and recognized as refugees, because the world has now evolved to a point where, even if it doesn't say so in the convention, people fleeing civil war are generally treated, if they cross an international border, as refugees. The international community responds with assistance and aid and protection, and the hosting countries, even if they don't call them refugees, essentially treat them as if they were refugees. These are ways in which the convention definition has been expanded. But in the book, we try to flip it. In fact, we do flip it. And we start, just as we did with the principles, we say, so what would a responsible international system, who would an international system protect if they were being responsible? And what we come up with is the idea that we say that there should be an international response, international responsibility, when persons who are forced from their homes cannot return, where return is not reasonable or feasible, and the hosting state is unable to protect and assist them, which seems very commonsensical, doesn't it? You know, we don't want to send people back to where they're going to be harmed in a serious way, and if the state in which they're in can't take care of them, then the international community probably should take care of them. So that's the principle we work with. We couldn't come up with a good phrase. We have a really bad phrase to describe people, but we call these folks fleers of necessity, or necessary fleers. In other words, we don't try to say these are people. We don't use the word refugee because it's a much broader group, but we say people who had, I wouldn't say no choice, but who were. It was a reasonable decision of that person to say life in my home was no longer tolerable. Those are people the international community should respond to. Now look how that's expanding the coverage here. First of all, it gets to IDPs, right? So it was said earlier, you know, this arbitrary line of state, whether you're forced out of your country because of a gun or a falling bomb or whatever reason, it shouldn't matter whether you cross the international line or not. The harm to you of being forced back is the same. And so this definition of necessary flee would cover IDPs. From the earlier charts you see, once you say that, you have doubled the number of people protected, because there are twice as many IDPs as are refugees in the world. More importantly, those charts just were about people fleeing violence and conflict. But under our definition, we would take people forced for other reasons. So we would look seriously at people who flee because they because of the effects of the climate crisis. Now that's a crisis. That's something worth calling a crisis, the climate crisis. Or other environmental causes, or natural disasters, they're called sometimes geophysical events. And there you don't have targeted persecution unless you think the guy upstairs is targeting you with an earthquake in some way. But you have people forced from their homes with serious needs. So this is a very capacious definition once you get IDPs and climate, environment, other things in. And this leads to usually the first major objection is, are you out of your mind? We have a system now that can't take care of people who are classically defined as refugees, and you want to double or triple or quadruple the number of people now the international community is supposed to watch over. And we say, yeah. We say, one, it follows as a matter of political commitment, because I think you agreed with all the principles I gave you, because they seem commonsensical enough. But secondly, and this is really the important argument here, is that we're actually already responding to these people. If you think about it, when there's a flood or an earthquake, humanitarian aid is flown in, whether it's bilateral from the US or UK or Germany, directly into places, or through UNICEF or the World Health Organization, whatever. We have systems for taking care of people, which to me already says that we recognize the responsibility we have to be responsible to these, to be responsive to these people's needs who are forced out of their homes. We need to go further on the climate change side, but certainly on the natural disaster side, we are already almost there. If that's true, to say that we now should be understanding the system as protecting this broader number is not as big a leap as you might think. This is why I keep coming back to the point that this is manageable, because we're sort of halfway there or more than that in our notion of what is morally right to do, even if we haven't created the institutions that can most effectively do it. Now, the second usual objection is, but what about extreme poverty, right? What about people who can't just want to live a better life? And isn't the line here really between migrants and refugees really hard to draw? And the answer is, yes, it is. It is extremely hard to draw in many cases because these causes influence one another and or even more, just on a political ground, why distinguish someone who can't work from someone who has been flooded out of his or her home? Should the response be the same? We don't have a great answer on that one, quite frankly. I think the answer is that, in fact, we do, in cases of mass economic collapse, the world does respond. When in 2015, several 100,000 Somalis left Somalia, in part because of the conflict, but also in part because of a drought and because of an inability, the death of herds and the inability of people to live their lives. The world responded. UNHCR treated them as refugees without asking a lot of questions. It's much harder in an individual case where someone says, I live in this country and I couldn't get a job for 10 years and I'm now coming to Sweden and applying for asylum. That's a much tougher case. But in the cases of mass famine or of mass drought or other kinds of things, I think we do recognize the principle that we should be helping there. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit longer than where's Andreas? Can I take a few more minutes? Okay. So we have the commitments. We have an argument here as to who they should apply, and we know how far they fall short. Here are the ways they fall short. There's the numbers are large, not overly large, but they're large. Anyway, you can look through them. The rights are denied. There's no international responsibility system. We end up with the second exile. So how do we begin to solve that? And here are some of our answers. So the first is this expanded notion of who should be entitled to international protection. That's the legal phrase here, the international phrase of international protection. And we give a much broader category of people. Secondly, rights need to be enforced. As I mentioned, these rights are violated routinely around the world, and it's always surprising to me. We have lots of legal movements around the world, whether it's or in the United States, whether it's abolition movement for incarceration, or go back to the civil rights cases on school desegregation, or whatever we're attacking. We have strategies for working on massive violations of rights, and we don't have an international movement for refugee rights. Now, you're not going to be able to go into court in every country in the world, and the ACLU can't file a suit. But there are many courts where you can. So in Kenya, for example, when Kenya announced it was going to close the Dadaab refugee camp, one of the largest refugee camps at the time, a lawsuit was brought in the Kenya Supreme Court saying this violates the convention, it violates the Constitution of Kenya, and it violates the laws of Kenya. And the court said, yes, it does, and Dadaab wasn't closed. And there are other examples around the world. Almost every action of Donald Trump on migration has been stopped in the courts by some really good lawyering. So I think a lot more could be done on rights. It's not something UNHCR presses around the world, even though they should be. Why? Because UNHCR needs permission to operate in the countries it operates in. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't march into a country and say, now we're working with refugees in Sudan or in Uganda or wherever they go. They need the permission of that country. And there's a really delicate balance, because if UNHCR turns around and says, you know what, country, yeah, you're hosting 500,000 people, but none of them are able to work, and none of them are getting the rights they want, and that's terrible, what's that country going to say? They're going to say, all right, then we're not going to take these people anymore. We'll get rid of them. So I think the fight has to be fought by lawyers or by political movements in which actually I think refugees can play a part. So rights has to be, we have to really seriously talk about the rights of refugees. The third, and I'll spend most of my time on this and then I'll be done, is the responsibility sharing. So when the convention is written in the 1950s, I remember I said the issue was these remaining 1 million refugees who are in Europe, and they were settled. And so the convention is actually the Convention on the Status of Refugees. We have people we know are refugees, and what rights should they get where they are. There was not created at the time, even though recommended by the Secretary General, it was not adopted to have some kind of sharing system around the world. Lebanon, a country of 4 million people, has 1 million refugees. And the United States, faints over 18,000 refugees, at least this administration does. I mean, obviously refugees could be, and if you distributed 25 million people throughout the world, you could do it in a way that wouldn't burden any one country, and people have come up with things. Oxfam International has an algorithm they've produced, which is interesting to look at, that looks at GDP and population and refugee flows in the past, whatever, and assigns a number for every country in the world. And when you look at it, it's not burdensome for any country in the world if we could have that system, or any system that looks like it. We don't have it. It's not in the convention, and I think it's the major cause of the second exile, because countries of the world don't step up and say, we will help out here. The bargain that is struck between the global north and the global south is the global north will pay, not enough, but will pay the global south to keep refugees. Right? That's the responsibility sharing we have now. Inadequate money going south. It's not one of, we will take refugees, we'll think about other pathways for refugees, we'll come up with other kinds of programs. So we need a new international architecture here that creates some form of working on these solutions in a comprehensive way. The next, well, it's a little bust there. Okay, the right to mobility. I've talked about mobility as important. So how do you get that going? And if you think about the wall, yes, Germany took 1 million asylum seekers and then everybody closed their borders and it was all over. So how do you get that one going? So I want to go back now to even before 1950. There was a high commissioner before there was the convention, back in the early part of the 20th century. The League of Nations created a high commissioner for refugees. And the first high commissioner was named Fridtjof Nansen. He was a polar explorer who never quite got to the North Pole, but got close and got famous for getting close, I guess. And he was a distinguished diplomat, and he became the High Commissioner for Refugees. And what he noticed, this was in the time of the ending of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. People were outside countries they'd lived in, or they were in new countries, and they'd been, after the Russian, the Russian Revolution and the war, people had lost their nationality if they ever had one, and people were without documents, they were without identity. And what Nansen did is he created a document that said, this is my name, this is where I was born, this is where I'm from, this is who I am. And these pieces of paper became known as Nansen passports, and still referred to as Nansen passports. They didn't give people a right to travel around the world, but they facilitated travel because someone could go from Germany to France and say, here, I have a document, internationally created document saying who I am, you can let me in. And then they could go back to Germany if they didn't find the job in France. So we have some history of refugees giving, at the very beginning of the refugee regime, given documents, given a system that facilitated their movement. Now add to that the fact that we are creating, at the regional level, massive amounts of free movement. When we think about Europe and immigrants, we think about, Europe's putting up all these walls to keep people from Africa from coming across the Mediterranean. That's true. That's true. But there are 500 million Europeans that have free movement through 27 countries. Well, we may have to change that number. We're not sure. But, 500 million people traveling freely, which would have been unthinkable 50 years ago, right? To have that kind of movement. Africa now, the African Union has now adopted a protocol to the African Union Treaty that would provide free movement through the African continent for states that, or states that sign on to free movement. In South Africa, Mercosur is an arrangement. In West Africa, ECOWAS. There are beginning to be these regional free movement issues. And I say this to my students all the time because the usual view is the world is closing borders down and locking people in. And yes, that's true in some ways, particularly when you have this inter-regional movement. but it's actually opening up huge amounts of free movement, which may be much more the story down the road. I could imagine, believe it or not, a North American free movement agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada in our lifetimes. Maybe not my lifetime, and some of the younger people's here's lifetime. It's not unthinkable. That's a trend that's happening at the same time. So I'm saying all this, but what I'm saying is I don't think you could get a right of refugee movement around the world, that you give a refugee document and that person can travel anywhere. But you might be able to negotiate regional free movement. So if the IGAD countries are now IGAD is in the Horn of Africa. It's Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Djibouti, and I'm leaving something out, another country. They have economic arrangements, and there is some movement among those countries, but add refugees to that. If you're a refugee in one of those countries, let them move. What's the benefit of that? The benefit is people can move to where they can take care of themselves. You don't need massive humanitarian programs. You don't need big new development programs. So I actually think, if I could change anything in the world, it would be, on the refugee system, it would be really recognizing this right of mobility. I think it's the key to really changing the system in a dramatic way. And the last thing here, I'll stop here, is on refugee voice. We have got to enhance the way we pay attention to and listen to refugees. And there is some good development on this. There's a group now called the Global Refugee-Led Network, and some other refugee groups that for the first time have gotten together into refugee congresses and have begun to come up with manifestos on what refugees are demanding from the system. This is all new. I sat for 5 years when I was at UNHCR in big international meetings on refugees, and there were no refugees speaking. It should have struck me as odd. It now strikes me as odd. The moment I thought, oh, well, it's about states. I guess the states get to speak. But why on earth refugees wouldn't be there speaking? So these things are doable. And there are steps being taken, I think, now by UNHCR to be more inclusive of refugee voices. So, and here's the very last question is, so how do you do this? Because if states are the problem, how do you convince them to do this? And I could say a lot more about this, but the one thing I'll say here is this is a political fight. States are not going to act better because you say, oh, you're better than that state, be moral. Nor are states going to act when academics come in and write papers showing, refugees are really good for your country. Nor when academics, which we like to do, say, states, it's really in your best interest to be better to refugees, better on security. I have this sneaking feeling that states understand their interests better than academics understand their interests. Not always, but usually. So this is going to be a political movement. It's the only thing that's going to move states is politics here. And that means refugee organization. It means organization in our communities. It means the work that people in this room are doing on the local level is incredibly important in terms of building a political mobilization for refugee rights that can start locally and grow. It's going to mean changing the people who are running this government at the national level. Maybe the most important thing we can do for refugee rights, which is not a direct frontal, going after how we help refugees more, but you may need to change the other parts of the system, like the people in control, who will then be more open to these kinds of appeals and the like. But this ultimately is, it is a question of global morality, but it's a question that will only be resolved through global politics. Thank you.
We open up the floor for questions to Professor Aleinikov. Take the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was struck by, even in what you were just saying in answer to this last question, how important the structure of the state is. And when we think about solutions, right to work, right to mobility, and expansion of protections, et cetera. But I was also wondering, when you're talking about global responsibility, that does seem to provide the possibility of thinking outside the state, right? And so I was wondering whether when we start to do that, whether the opportunities for refugee voices get to be particularly important, because those international possibilities for cooperation are no longer depending upon, I mean, they can even be virtual, they can be taking place digitally, and so is there a way that you've been thinking about in your book or elsewhere through which those voices can be enhanced or brought into some particularly vocal power through these networks of cooperation?
Yeah.
Because when we think about the state, all signs seem to be, towards shutting those voices down rather than opening them up. So,
yeah, no,
maybe
it's
you
a,
could
it's a
comment.
really good question. We don't address it much in the book, but there are people who are beginning to think about this. I've talked with sort of crazy computer guys who want to create use blockchain technology to not only create a secure refugee identity, but a cryptocurrency for refugees. So, refugee coin or something. You can imagine that. Well, I mean, it's actually an interesting idea. If you think about it, you could put out a currency. It wouldn't have to be backed 100%. You could just sort of issue these coins, and if there are other states or other institutions, established businesses that accepted them, you could actually create a refugee currency. I think you could create a card like an Anson. We call this in the book an Anson Passport Plus, where you could actually create an identity card with a chip, and the UNHCR can put $100 every month on it and let the person travel around the world and start their own business or build some capital or whatever. But the use of social technology is really important. So these refugee networks I'm describing now are doable because they can talk to people all over the world and organize through social media. So I think that greatly enhances the possibility of getting stories out, informing the world, but also of communicating among people to build political movements. I mean, it's happened in the past. I mean, before social media, people actually communicated. They wrote letters, and Tom Paine wrote letters to people, and things. Didn't we have George Washington's letter earlier from Evan? But it's been materially enhanced now with social media, and it can be and should be used to communicate that way.
Hi, I'm Adam Goodman, Latin American Latino Studies and History here at UIC. Thanks so much for your provocative talk, and I wanted to follow up and ask, along the same lines you've been discussing, perhaps some of the limitations you see to international cooperation and international agreement, as well as what individual nation states can do, kind of from a ground up. You mentioned that you'd be happy to discuss more about what's happening now in this country. During the Q&A, but I also wanted to throw in that I agree with you that facts don't seem to matter oftentimes, and I worry that the really disturbing, compelling personal narratives don't seem to matter in some cases either. Kind of what are the limits of the stories that might grab people's attention but won't result in any action? And beyond conveying facts, beyond telling compelling stories, what other possibilities might there be for individuals, organizations, or nations to try to make a change that would matter in the lives of so many tens of millions?
Can I
Voting and marching.
Can I make a follow-up on that question? Because I think that one of the things that really strikes me as being incredibly important is that the very powerful idea that these people deserve special treatment because of their special vulnerability, because that's the main idea behind the convention, is a very powerful idea. And nonetheless, it has lost so much currency. So I think one has to ask oneself, what led to this? And what were the reasons why actually, the battle of public opinion has been lost so far? And as you rightly point out, it's a political battle here. It's just a matter of rephrasing and saying, well, this is a very important idea that we should. But so far it has been lost. And governments get away with the most outrageous things. As you were showing what the Australian government has been doing, which is, honestly, incredibly cruel. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that from a historical point of view.
Well, a couple of things. So I'm not sure it's been lost. In Australia, it's lost because the the so-called Liberal Party is, there's no difference between the parties much on refugee protection. Canada hasn't been lost. Even in the United States, we have a president who's been imposing lots of stuff, but the majority of Americans very clearly favor the U.S. refugee policy. And with the Democratic administration, I expect those numbers would jump back up. I'm not sure how much what's been done on asylum seekers at the southwest border can be easily taken back just because there are political issues there, but certainly on the refugee number. So I think actually that tradition stays pretty strong. I think there are two things going on, the political wins against us. One, and there's some good historical work written on this in the United States context, is that, and I think was alluded to this morning, you know, when it was people fleeing communist regimes, it was easy to there was a political reason to welcome people in. Remember, we used to call these people defectors, defected from the regime. And there's some thinking that once the political side went away and you just had the mere humanitarian perspective, that it became weaker at that point, because that's harder to keep appealing just to our humanitarianism, because we tend to think about people closer to home, our families, our communities, maybe our countries, as where our humanitarianism should apply, and then only later to people overseas. So that may be one. The other, the rise of populist politics, where we're not caused by immigrants, but immigrants quickly become the scapegoats, right? So the immigrants aren't a threat to any of these countries, but they become the convenient target of a politics of resentment that has a lot more to do with not even economic insecurity, but security about a country that has left people out. So whether it's in this country where the middle of the country, leaving out Chicago, feels it's been abandoned by the coasts, you know, by the elitist coasts or whatever, you know, that kind of politics of resentment then gets taken out on some other group. And what Republicans have been remarkably successful doing, instead of a left-wing populism where, like a Sanders populism, where the attack goes to the people with power and money, they've been able to deflect it on the people with no power and no money, meaning immigrants, right? So I think those are maybe two different explanations from very different places. There may be others that account for what's happened on the refugee side. But I think there is inherently a belief in this country, at least on the resettlement side. And interestingly enough, on the money side, this is really unexpected, and I don't have a good account for it. But the United States is the largest contributor to UNHCR. And under, Reagan, under Trump, the amount of money has gone up to UNHCR. And UNHCR is now getting about $1.6 billion from the United States, which is triple what it was 10 years ago. Some of that increase went up under Obama, but it has continued to go up under Trump. Now, part of that can be, well, let's take care of them over there so they don't come here, right? Whatever. But it is interesting that even on the money side, that has stayed there. So it's not all doom and gloom on the side. Poland and Hungary may be different situations, but of course there are no refugees in Poland or Hungary. I mean, so it's in some ways, again, it's a phony straw man there. It's not. They never were major resettlement countries that has now been lost. I think Australia is the toughest one here in terms of a real unified view that we don't want these people. Although they I think, are still the second or third largest resettlement country in the world. What countries don't like are spontaneous arrivals at their border, right? And that's what's happened in this country at the southwest border through this administration. And that's what happened when the flow came across the Mediterranean. So if you had and I say this again to go back to my idea of a global platform. If you had this platform on displacement, that in the second year of the Syrian crisis said, okay, Europe, you're going to take 100,000 a year. US, you take 40, 50,000 a year. Canada, you take 10,000. Australia, 5,000. You would have had, I think, a system that did enough to show there was hope in the system that you wouldn't have had the mass flow over the Mediterranean if you had a rational system. And this, let me take this one step further. And this goes back to the manageable point. I mean, one of the answers, how do you overcome states? One answer is you work you disaggregate the states. So most states have bureaucracies that deal with refugees. And they're usually made up of people who like refugees and believe in the refugee program of that country. The PRM, the Population, Refugees, and Migration Division of the State Department, handles the refugee money, they handle the resettlement program. They like refugees. If you could get the politicians out of there, the civil servants could take care of these problems at that level because the numbers are not that huge. You could get agreements. Again, think about in the flow through Mexico. Okay, so maybe it's 50, 100,000 Central Americans. It's not a large number if people are divided up among the region as a whole, or you have a lawful admission program directly from those countries for people who want to work in the United States, expand the numbers. You can handle the asylum seekers. If you could let people, sort of senior civil servants get together with their counterparts in other countries and say, let's work out a system that takes care of that. That's the, depoliticize, recognize it's manageable, solve it.
Hi, my name is Alex Fryer, and I'm a graduate student in public policy here at UIC. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. My question is actually about how surveillance fits into some of the ideas that you've presented today, particularly if we're thinking about increasing mobility options for refugees. Basically, I think we're seeing increased surveillance of these groups already as the technology continues to develop. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the future of this as well.
What are your thoughts? You have some thoughts. What are they?
I think we're just going to see continued surveillance, not only of refugees.
Of everybody. Yeah, I think that's, we now have face recognition stuff. We have DNA, want to take DNA of asylum seekers southwest border. I think this is across the board. We're living in that kind of world. And if you're going to have, if you had a right to mobility, it would come with some kind of identification that would make you immediately recognizable elsewhere, but that's going to come with our passports and everything else. So, yes, and I guess the problem with refugees in particular is for family members who've been left behind. If you're really an opponent of the state and you've fled, and the concern about that information getting back to the state in some way, that you have an additional risk, not just to you, but to others in that situation. This is why people are thinking about these blockchain strategies for refugee identities, because right now UNHCR would like to create a smart card for all refugees, an identity card, and other people saying, no, leave that to the refugee community. Refugees can create their own identity that can be, through blockchain. I'm saying this without really understanding what the hell I'm talking about, but can be kept secure and can't be changed and can be relied upon in a way, but it's not owned by any single holder of information and can't be changed or abused in that way. So people are beginning to think about that as well as an end around state control of data, but that's a long way away, and I think we're going to have the kind of surveillance you're describing.
Please. You need to ask my permission. Yeah, please.
Kemal Kirişçi from Brookings. I'll be a speaker tomorrow. So, thanks, Alex. I have two very quick questions. You spoke about responsibility sharing more like resettlement. And when we look at the graph that you show us, that's the red line that's dipping. If we were to open up that line, we would see that most of the resettlement countries, overwhelmingly, if not all, are Western countries, and only a subgroup of Western countries. Moving forward, do you see other countries being recruited as resettlement countries? And the second question, when you had your slide about policy recommendations, what I thought I missed, I may have missed out, but what seemed to be missing is return. What can be done about it as one of the classic durable solutions?
Yeah, so additional resettlement countries remains the hope of the future. Every year it remains the hope of the future for UNHCR because it's hard. Japan became a resettlement country, and I think the first year took in 19 refugees, seriously. So these numbers are not going to go up dramatically, and it's never going to be. There are these alternate pathways of work mobility that may be much more possible, where it doesn't come with a formal status of the right to stay in the country, but maybe to move to work. So I don't. But the kinds of solutions could be there are also things in the hosting states that could be done. I didn't talk at all about the World Bank's new work on development, but this has really been, this has been a game changer in the refugee system, where the development agencies saying, we now take displacement seriously. It's not just for the humanitarian, it's not just for UNHCR and UNICEF, but the World Bank and other development actors should come in and help out hosting countries to give aid to the regions that are hosting the refugees as well as the refugees themselves. And the World Bank has put billions of dollars behind that. It hasn't been as easy to do as people thought it might be, but that is a significant changer where you're able to actually build greater support, get rid of the second exile in the hosting state. As to returns, Kamal, I mean, that really depends on solving these conflicts, right? And the Security Council is just broken. I mean, we're not there. We're not able to solve these conflicts, and that's, it also goes to root causes, could be asked the same way, and we don't talk much about root causes. So on both these fronts, I think people like me in the refugee world have given up. We don't think we're smart enough to solve either the root causes or the peace and security side of this. We leave that to other people. But there was a time in the refugee literature, 20, 30 years ago, where scholars would say, we got to work on root causes. And then we realized we had nothing smart to say about root causes. This will be different, by the way, in climate, because look, everything I've said here is going to be irrelevant in a few years, at least in some ways, because the movement based on climate is going to be much larger than the movement based on conflict. Now, a lot of that most of it may be internal, but it's going to be huge amounts. It's going to be an awful lot of movement. There you can actually talk about prevention of movement. In the conflict situation, when you talk about prevention, it sounds like you're keeping people in very dangerous situations. But you can talk about resilience of communities that undergo natural disasters, or you can talk about irrigation ditches or other forms of, you can't talk about locally reducing CO2, but globally you can. But you can talk about ways that people who want to stay in their country can stay. And so there was also a time in the literature in the 1990s when people talked about a right to remain. This was big for Sadako Ogato, the High Commissioner for Refugees at the time. And then people said, well, that's the right to remain is going to be used by the global north, as we called it, then we were called developing states, to keep people in. Your right to remain means you have to remain. But on the climate side, you may actually be able to talk again. I'd be interested in thinking through whether you can begin to talk about a right to remain if we undertake the kinds of actions we need to on adaptation and resilience that will allow people to stay. And in that way, climate movement might be much different than conflict movement, because we do have the ability to work maybe on both ends, both on the return side and on the root causes side, in a way that in the conflict situation has been very tough to move on.
Hi, my name is Anaid Gomtian. I'm a PhD candidate here in the Department of Political Science. Thank you for your talk. It struck me as you were talking about the reform agenda, things like mobility, political engagement, right to work, social protections, education, that while we speak about national policy regarding these things, really where they are implemented is at the city level, and especially as cities gain prominence on a global stage. I wanted to ask you, I know it's a bit outside of the scope of your talk, but your thoughts on roles of cities within sort of this refugee regime.
Yeah, not at all. We address this in the book. I mean, as I said, one of our solutions for dealing with states is getting around the states. So working at the regional level and working at the subnational level. And cities have become really important in this regard. And there's now a new Mayor's Migration Council that Open Societies Foundation has put together, all these different groups of mayors. There's the C40, which is about climate and mayors, and 100 resilient cities. And so cities are coming together. Just as you said, it's a place where everyone says the rubber meets the road. And many cities, like New York, has New York IDs that don't ask people's status, but say you're a resident of New York. And a lot of the good programs have been adopted at the local level. In the U.S., as you know, there are so-called sanctuary cities that have said we're not going to cooperate with ICE, et cetera. So I think there's huge amounts of work that can be done at the local level, even if you can't change national policies. You may. Now, I think I think we've jumped on that bandwagon a little too quickly because we said we live in a red country, but we have all these blue cities. We've got a lot of red cities too, or at least purple cities. So, it's not as if turning everything over to the cities is going to be great and there are a lot of cities around the world that don't treat immigrants or asylum seekers particularly well. So we have to be careful about how we talk about that. But cities are increasingly important actors in this regard, it seems to me, and recognized as such now. So the High Commissioner for Refugees every year has a High Commissioner's dialogue on protection. And a few years ago, it involved mayors. It was on urban responses to refugee flows. So that's been recognized at the global level and also now national and local level. It's a good point.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Cam Nowick. I'm a graduate of Jane Addams School of Social Work. And I was sitting here feeling sorry for each and every one of the refugees until it dawned on me suddenly that I'm also a refugee here within my own city. In the 60s, our whole entire community had to move from what is now UIC. And we moved further and further south. And it just goes to show that you could be a refugee within your own city.
I'm glad you mentioned that because this gives me a chance to pitch something else here. My podcast, which is called Tempest Tossed, and it's available on all major platforms. But we're going to be doing an episode. It's going to be called Doubly Displaced in the Bronx. And it's exactly your point. We're going to be talking to immigrants who moved to New York, either displaced because of economic situations or because they came as refugees. And now in the Bronx, they're facing displacement because of gentrification and the fact that landlords who want them out threaten to call ICE unless they do X, Y, Z. So these are the displaced, but of course we have citizens who are displaced as well in all our communities. So and that's an interesting point about whether. I hadn't really thought about this, but we're thinking about Andre's question: how do you mobilize support for refugees? And maybe we haven't all been refugees, but maybe we all are just sort of one rent check away from being refugees in our big cities. So, that's worth thinking about. It's a good point.
Hi, my name is Hannah Quagle. I'm a doctoral student at the School of Occupational Therapy. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and yet somehow very palatable talk. My question is, given all that the research that you've presented and the ideas for these policies, what would you say are the most tangible and actionable steps going forward? So what is maybe the game plan or the timeline of what it looks like? What do we do with this information?
Yeah, pray. Might be the most helpful. No. So it depends what level you're talking about. At the global level, I think the global platform on displacement is actionable. And I'm going to keep working with others to try to push for that. Probably needs to be expanded to take a new climate movement as well. And it may be that climate becomes the way in because the world is kind of mobilizing around climate now in a way that it's sort of easier to talk about climate than it is about IDPs. When you say we need a convention on IDPs, people say IDP. But if you say people moving because of climate, whether it's sudden onset or slow onset, it may be the climate really provides the way. And so at the global level, I think really working on this kind of institutional change at the global level and maybe through climate may be doable. At the national level, I think the big step has to be after Trump. And I don't know if that's 6 months, 1 year, or 5 years. But there's going to be a lot of stuff that has to be unwound when politics change here, and that's not easy to think through. So sort of thinking, there are already groups meeting, of course, in Washington, transition plans, right? These are basically people who want jobs in the next administration, so they form a group on transition planning. But it's important work to think through about how you might actually be able to change. And then I think thirdly, at the local level, one is to urge cities to adopt these kinds of ID proposals. There's a lot that can be done at state and local level. So, New York for years had a Republican Senate and a Democratic House lower assembly. It's now all Democratic, governor, and they've now passed a driver's license for undocumented folks. This is not refugees, but this is beyond the brother. They have a New York State ID license. They passed a Dreamer law that gives tuition aid to undocumented students in state schools. So there are things that can be done at the state and local level and even just at the city level. If you're a blue city in a red state, you can do things at the city level, adopting policies that refuse to cooperate with ICE and things. So there's a lot of stuff that can be done. And then more on the refugee side is continuing to build the support for resettlement. As was mentioned, these resettlement agencies are dying because they had 100,000 folks and now they're down to 18,000 resettling, and that they rely on federal money. The federal money's not there. They're laying off staff and stuff. So now some of that's been redirected into kind of citizenship training for people and other stuff that can be done. But on the refugee side is to really keep talking about resettlement, so when the time comes we can get the numbers back. We have a structure for doing that. And I think also pushing for this private resettlement alternative, this model borrow from the Canadians could be a positive thing. And then the narratives. I mean, it's interesting. There, as you can imagine, again in Washington and elsewhere, there are all these political consultants. What should the soundbite be that we get? And there has been a huge on the immigration story in the United States. It's been a huge swing over the last 30 or 40 years, where Americans thought immigration was bad for the United States. Now, 60, maybe higher percentage of Americans think immigration is a benefit to the United States. Don't take that for granted. I mean, that was a remarkable campaign that was very carefully done over time by people. And so there are political messages that can be given. I think the most effective I've seen on refugees were some ads that were done with Canadian families. And it wasn't the story. The ads were not, here's a refugee who was living in a terrible situation in a camp and now she's able to go to school and, that's a wonderful story. That wasn't the one that worked when they did this. The one that worked was talking to the Canadian family, an absolutely ordinary Canadian, well, that's redundant. A Canadian family, just average people living a decent life in their locality, and talking to them about what it meant to them to be able to sponsor refugees in. And what they said was, this is the greatest thing I've ever done. And most of it was the person talking about it, and then the refugee kind of came in at the end. But it was about what that kind of work can do for us as human beings. That's very powerful work. So those kinds of testimonies from churches and mosques and synagogues that have worked on resettlement in the past, about what it has meant for members of those communities to be involved in the refugee resettle movement, can be really powerful. Yeah. Does that mean I'm done?
Yeah, no. I have a...
It's so long, there's nothing more I know.
No, I wanted to ask you a more personal question, actually. You had the, I don't know, the privilege or the burden of working 5 years as Deputy High Commissioner. It's an incredibly influential position, as is, Professor Alenikov was underscoring. It's a huge agency, which with global presence and global responsibilities, and that is at the cornerstone of major diplomatic sort of struggles and missions. So what's your personal reflection about those years? Frustration, mixed of those. The UNHCR oftentimes takes a lot of heat for the things that doesn't do, and oftentimes their views not seriously entertained. People don't understand the constraints under which they work, and you laid those out. But on a personal basis, if you could just briefly reflect on those years, and with the distance and the and the fact that you're not working there anymore, so you can probably speak more freely about it.
Well, two things. First, on the first point, tremendous respect for the people who work at UNHCR. Look, it's a big bureaucratic UN organization. In saying that, you know what I'm saying. I mean, it moves slowly. It's hard to change. On the other hand, more than about a third of the staff lived in non-family duty stations. What that meant is they were living in countries where they were not, under UN rules, allowed to bring their family to live with them. And I stayed one night in a compound in Somalia, and I was, get me out of here. And there were people who would live there for 2 years and take care of the internally displaced people in Somalia. I mean, this is really dramatic. And I used to go to the staff when I'd go around the field, I'd say, you're all crazy. And they'd look at me like, what? And I said, no, come on. You've taken these jobs in some of the most dangerous places in the world where you can't live with your family, and you move every 2 or 3 years. So what kind of person are you? But I said it out of enormous respect and admiration for the work that they did. Personally, for me, it was most really remarkable work. I think the main thing for me was I realized I thought I knew a lot until I got. I mean, I taught refugee law for years to law students, and I could parse the language, and then I got there and I realized that was irrelevant to most of the world's refugees. It wasn't the, 30,000 applicants for asylum in the United States. It was the 5 million refugees Syrians in countries of first asylum, and that's really what got me to the second exile. I think the book comes out of that experience by saying it's the second exile that's the real problem, which the global North ignores because out of sight, out of mind. We want the second exile. We want them there. It's cheap. Keep them there. We'll give them a little bit of money. We don't want them coming our way. And so it was really recognizing that as the central problem that was eye-opening to me, and then that got me involved in a set of reform efforts at the institution that I was happy to be a part of and try to push through.
All right, well, let's give a round of applause to Professor Aleinikov.